We now need to resolve questions related to the binding of material. What exactly is it that enables atoms to coalesce into visible and measurable three-dimensional objects? Perhaps this question is best introduced with this analogy. Take some wood under a ceramic bowl that holds iron filings, and then set the wood on fire. The flames from that fire would transfer heat into the crucible, but it would then pass through that crucible and into the filings. When it reached the filings, then the heat would melt. Then the fire would go out and the iron would cool into a coalesced structure, and we'd be left with a pile of ashes, or carbon, from that burnt wood. So, what would have changed? What we're proposing is that the atoms, in that interaction of the fire, have remained inviolate, untouched. It is only their binding that has changed. What has happened is the bound condition of the wood has now transferred itself to the bound condition of the filings. The question then is this: is the exchange of energy between the wood and the iron simply the result of the passage of some binding material that is transferred through space and in time? Is the energy that enabled that interaction simply the result of material that binds matter, that coalesces objects in our visible universe, moving through space to an alternate structure in order to bind them? Now, back to the condition of that early nebula where matter is gradually being reorganized into a condition of charge balance. We've proposed that the creation of these electrons and protons are first made from random association of truths that form the early nebula. They're moving together into an interactive associations in response to an immutable principle to move to a condition of charge balance. Then, three of those electrons associate to form the proton, and this in turn, somehow, generates the formation of strings of dipoles that then structure the hydrogen atom. And we've also proposed that the potential is there to also transmute that simple hydrogen atom to more complex structures evident in our periodic table. If this explains the structure of the atom, then we need to address how it is that these atoms could become bound in star structures that we see moving out of nebula. How is it that the massive sun structures come into being? What is it that binds that structure together? Here we simply rely on an explanation that conforms to Occam's razor. We've argued that the only thing that can interact with the magnetic field is another magnetic field. All else would be out of reach, out of the boundary constraints of the field. A single or one-dimensional magnetic field, or string, would therefore also be able to interact with another field. Therefore, effectively, all we need is a single orbiting string of magnetic dipoles to interact between two hydrogen atoms to bind them. This can be seen in the mind's eye as a cog interacting with the outer energy levels of both atoms. Effectively, this cog could spin like this, or like this, or like this. And that way, a single one-dimensional field would be able to bind atoms regardless of their valence condition. We therefore propose that it's this field that is entirely extraneous to the atom that is actually responsible for binding material structures in our visible universe. In effect, the number of those strings would then be consistent with the mass of the bound material being one string to one atom, bound. If this was superimposed as an explanation for the binding of all material, then we'd have an explanation for the Casimir effect. Therefore, what we're now proposing is that the structure of larger bodies, such as the Sun, are the result of binding that is done by these one-dimensional strings that are resolved from the chaos of the nebula, and that these are somehow required in the process of resolving that chaotic state back into the orderly field structures. And all this restructuring because the dipoles are compelled to regain a field condition of charge balance. But just to stress this, we're actually proposing is that when these binding fields become broken, when friction, or when an opposing electric field breaks those strings, then the actual dipoles, those binding fields, move out of that cold, fast, invisible condition, and they become hot and big and slow. They're suspended in space, exactly as are our nebulae suspended in space. And they're moving through space within our dimensions, being seen as flame or flux. And they're moving in order to find something to bind. What we're rather presumptuously proposing is that fire itself comprises the quantum of magnetic dipoles that have tumbled out of those hidden, invisible dimensions to be seen and experienced as fire. Fire, therefore, is the quantum of that binding field, those dipoles, that have moved into a chaotic state and that now search out material in order to bind them. Then it will again become as cold and as fast as invisible as it is now hot and slow and visible. It will also become as orderly and structured as it is now disorderly and unstructured. We kicked off this exercise with the proposal that there's a single force that has not been identified, being the magnetic force, not by the standard model. However, we also know that the electromagnetic force is certainly a force that is extensively used throughout all fields of technology and in the generation of energy. But how exactly does this force operate? If, as we propose, this force is simply a supplemental or a secondary force. What we now propose is that the measurable voltage imbalance is the result of those same binding strings of dipoles that have structured into an orderly field condition, but that are somehow unable to join those open-ended strings. They're balanced in all senses other than in being able to complete that required orbit. Over a battery, for instance, they would simply look like this. We've suggested that all coalesced material is bound by binding fields. The nature of the field is that it orbits. Therefore, one half of each field would precisely oppose the other half. This direction defines its charge, and being orbital, then there's a dual charge. When those open-ended strings of voltage from the supply source sense a closed circuit condition, then effectively they can move through that circuit to join those two open-ended strings. They can then effectively orbit. The circuit closes, and then the voltage can move through the circuit. But just as an aside, they're still orderly, and therefore they move at twice the speed of light, which in our dimensions would be seen as being instantaneous. But the voltage is either positive or negative, never both. Convention has it that a positive voltage will move a positive current flow clockwise through a circuit, and correspondingly a negative voltage would produce a negative current moving anti-clockwise through a circuit. We're dealing with a battery supply. So assume a positive clockwise flow. That's essentially a single direction, which will be experienced by that circuit material as a single imbalanced charge. We've already proposed that one magnetic field can only interact with another magnetic field due to the boundary constraints explained earlier. We've also proposed that the atomic condition of that material is stable, governed as it is by the strong nuclear force, and that it's substantially inviolate to any but extreme charge or extreme heat. But we've also proposed that the binding fields holding that atomic structure together is plastic, and it can easily dismantle from that bound structure to become chaotic and hot. Therefore, these fields would be more readily available to give a path for the current flow from that voltage supply source than from those atoms. However, and this is the point, only one half of each of those orbiting binding strings is able to interact with the field. The other half will be of a light charge and it would therefore be repelled. So, here's what we propose takes place. The current flows from the battery. Effectively, the quantum of those open strings that form voltage move their material through the circuit at twice the speed of light. In moving, they repel that half of the binding fields that have a light charge, and then they readily move through by interacting with the other half of those fields. But in doing so, they introduce a chaotic condition to those fields, as the binding fields release their hold on those atoms. They become somewhat chaotic, and in doing so they become bigger and hotter. This results in an expansion of the material that is now measurably hotter than its normal state, and measurably bigger. And this condition persists until the voltage of the source has depleted its potential difference, and it reflects no measurable or effective voltage imbalance. What we've argued is the logical probability that magnetic fields comprise the material of dipoles that structure along Faraday's lines of force and that assemble in orderly fields. We've also shown that the disturbance of this orderly field condition would result in the emanation of flux, here referred to as truants. The first such event, the singularity itself, would be from a disturbance in the greater universal field that is seen as a nebula. We've then proposed that this flux then responds to an immutable principle of charge balance that orders the flux into strings and into stable particles with composites inside those strings. This forms the foundation of matter, and it structures as an atom. Then binding fields assemble those atoms into suns. We propose that these suns have their own energy levels, which are two-dimensional magnetic fields. These fields hold their planets bound in an orbit around that sun, in exactly the same way as the electron is bound in its orbit around the atom's energy levels. We've argued that velocity and mass, here defined as volume, have an inverse proportional relationship. The faster the smaller, the bigger the slower. Therefore, logically, the smaller the particle, the faster its velocity. The size of the field dipole is therefore precisely 2c. This puts it out of range of light, and light therefore represents the limit to our visible dimensions. Anything faster, then it is invisible within our own dimensions of time and space. Therefore, we have also argued that the field structure and the structure in our visible universe occupies 3 dimensions each. Both operate in a different time frame, which makes a total of 8 dimensions. But we've also proposed that there's another dimension that is logically required, that is effectively smaller and faster than the field itself. These particles have been referenced as quarks, and they're proposed to operate in their own dimension of both space and time. But they are devoid of all dimensions of volume and only occupy a point in space. Therefore, this model proposes that the entire universe comprises a 10-dimensional binary system. The argument is that the magnetic field is the primary force and that the field is structured from a single dipole. In line with this argument, the one-dimensional field, the string, is then responsible for the weak nuclear force and for the laws of induction. The two-dimensional field is responsible for the strong nuclear force, and the three-dimensional field is responsible for gravity. Effectively, matter is moved to the center of a toroidal structure. In this way, too, antimatter would gravitate to the outer boundaries of the universe. Effectively, therefore, we propose that our universe is bound by antimatter, and that it has the potential to be as ordered in exactly the same way as matter is held bound inside that universal torus. These arguments in line with string theorists and with the proof of dark matter that has been measured by astrophysicists. Briefly, the argument goes that light only moves through space when it interacts with the field. Therefore, if the field is bent around a galaxy, then light will trace that bend. Therefore, do we endorse the requirement for dark matter being identified here as those magnetic dipoles that not only structure matter, but that hold matter bound inside the universe. we resolve the wave-particle duality, the size-mass ratio of the proton to the electron, and the Casimir effect. And we propose that the Higgs boson itself is the flux state of a magnetic dipole when it's in a chaotic state and separate from the field. When it structures as a field, then it again becomes invisible and immeasurable, other than as a magnetic field. It is then again dark matter.